Ontological Argument. You'll not find this argument in the On Guard book, like I said. And you this probably is not seen as the most effective or the most influential argument, but it's probably my favorite. This argument is purely philosophical. It basically conducts a thought experiment on the idea of the existence of a maximally great being. Alright, so this argument originated from a guy, a monk, named Anselm of Canterbury, or he's also considered a saint, Saint Anselm. Anselm was a great philosopher and a man who was in love with Jesus. His entire life, he couldn't think of any better life than to be a monk. The church wanted him to be a bishop. He wasn't interested in that. He eventually was forced to become a bishop, but what he really wanted to do was just spend time learning about God, praising God, and being in God's presence. That's what he wanted to devote his entire life to. Anselm's done other works. One of them is called Anselm's Book of Meditation and Prayers. That's a free download if you're interested. Is that up there? Yeah. Anselm's Book of Meditations. You can download that for free off the internet. I highly recommend it. I brought a little excerpt from it. So I just kind of want you to have an understanding of the mind and the heart of the guy that came up with this argument.
And remind me, what does ontological mean?
Ontology is discussing the existence of something, whether the topic of ontology of what it is we're discussing exists. So like the ontology of morality is whether morality actually exists. So here's a little excerpt from Anselm's Book of Prayers and Meditations. And it's like King James. Wherever we are, we live, move, and are in him, whilst also we have him within us. But returning from the beatitude that is to be, do thou with the eye of contemplation consider for a while the abundance of grace wherewith he hath enriched thee, even in this fleeting life. He, very God, whose dwelling is in heaven, whose throne among the angels, he to whom heaven and earth, with all that they contain, do bow down and obey, has offered himself to thee as thine abode, and furnished and prepared his presence for thee. For as the apostles teaches, in him we live and move and be. So to live, how sweet, so to move, how lovable, so to be, how desirable. For what more sweet than to have life in him who is the very life of bliss itself? What more lovable than to rule each movement or will or act of ours towards him and in him, seeing that he will establish us in an unending security? What more desirable than in aspiration and in act evermore him to be, in whom alone, or rather who alone, is true being, and apart from whom none can rightly be. I am who am, he says. And beautifully said it is, for he alone truly is, whose being is unchangeable. He, therefore, whose so unapproached being is being in so transcendent and unique a sense that he alone truly is, in comparison of whom all being is no being, then he would create thee to so great excellency that thou couldst not even comprehend the luster of thy dignity. What did he set as the sphere of thy being? What place of abode did he furnish for thee? Hear himself speak to his own in the gospel. Abide in me, and I in you. O inconceivable condensation! O blissful abiding! O glorious interchange! What condescension of the Creator to will that his creature should in him have dwelling! What inconceivable blessedness of the creature to dwell in the Creator! How great glory of a rational creation to be by so blessed in an interchange associated with the Creator, as that he in it, and it in him, should have their dwelling. Yes, he of his mercy has willed that we, so highly ennobled in our creation, should have the farther dignity of dwelling in him. He, governor of all things, without care or solicitude, existing over all. He, source and foundation of all things, without toil sustaining all. He, super excellent above foundation of all. He, super excellent above things, without vain glory transcending all. He, embracing each and all things, and everything that is, without extension of himself, enfolding all. He, the plenitude of all things, without narrowing of himself, fulfilling all. Yes, indeed, he, though his presence is nowhere wanting, has chosen for himself a kingdom of delights within us. The gospel bearing witness where it says, the kingdom of God is within you, and the kingdom of God is within us. And if God dwells in his realm, does not he whose kingdom is within us abide himself within us? Clearly so. For in like manner, if God is wisdom, and if the soul of the just is the dwelling of wisdom, he who is truly just has God abiding in him. And the apostle says, the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. That's the whole book. So, and it's free. So I would highly recommend downloading it and reading it. Like just, on it. Like sometimes I read it like in the morning or something. It's just a nice meditation book to read. So Anselm has a heart for God, and when he meditates on God, he views God as the greatest possible being that you can think of. If there were to be a greater being that you can think of, that would be God. And so that's what this whole ontological argument came about, is God being this maximum being and the philosophical consequences for it. It just says that which a greater cannot. This is, whenever Anselm wrote it, the way that he wrote it in the ontological argument, he wrote it as that which a greater cannot be thought. That which a greater cannot be, though, must exist.
Is this going to make sense when you get to the argument?
That's the way he wrote it.
I don't get the second phrase.
So he's saying that which a greater cannot be thought of.
Okay.
That which a greater cannot be thought of. So with the previous one, that must exist. I think that though it should be a thought.
Should that be thought?
Yeah, cannot be thought.
That would make more sense.
So that which a greater cannot be thought, that which a greater cannot be thought must exist. So he's saying this being that the greatest being that we can possibly think of at must exist. And that's what this argument's about. So today, reasonable faith and Dr. Craig, he uses Alvin Plantinga's version of the ontological argument. And that's basically what we're going to look at today. Alvin Plantinga is one of the leading Christian philosophers of our time. I don't have a slide for him, but if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Dr. Craig is highly influenced. His life was highly influenced by Alvin Plantinga. Plantinga. All right.
And he, telling you how, what he did with this argument,
Who? Well, we'll talk about that. That's the version of the ontological argument that we're going to discuss today is Alvin Plantinga's version of the argument. This argument originated from Anselm, and there's been lots of different versions of it over time. Today, we're going to be discussing Alvin Plantinga's version. All right, so here's the video. Here's the reasonable faith video for the ontological argument.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the Ontological Argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers, such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga, think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor, or a square circle, or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist. However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies. It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
All right. So, this is a summary of the argument. I know it seems to... And the initial reaction to this argument is people put their noses up towards it. And then we'll get into that. But just like with any of the arguments that I present, it goes through a deductive argument, which means for you to object to the conclusion, you have to object and be able to show that one of the premises that's shown is more false than true, right? So, does anyone have any questions about just understanding the concept of the argument? Now, I know it goes into possible worlds and all that stuff, and that can be somewhat confusing. Does anybody have any questions about that, or do you want me to go explain that a little bit more? Or is that pretty self-explanatory?
I think it's self-explanatory in that I need to toss it around in my brain for a few days to make it,
Yeah, well...
my brain takes a little more time. I have to kind of review it and get a grasp of it.
Yeah, it's just talking about we can imagine a world where I exist or I don't exist, or one of my kids doesn't exist, or it showed unicorns existing. If you are into the whole idea of evolution, over time, you can imagine the horse could have evolved to have a horn on its head. That seems possible. So it's a possible world where that could have happened. So there's all these different I don't want to say an infinite amount of possible worlds, but I'll say a lot. There's a lot of different possibilities when you think of possible worlds. And so basically the first premise is possible. It's at least possible that a maximally great being exists. And if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Okay? So there's some possible world out there that this maximally great being exists. Well, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in every possible world. Why is that? In order for the being to be maximally great, part of its attributes would be that if I were to think of a being that doesn't exist in every possible world, and I would think of a being that exists in every possible world, which one would be the greater being?
And it's possible in every world.
Exactly. So because that being is greater, then that would be the most maximally great being. So by definition, that being must exist in every possible world. So if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then the maximally great being exists in the actual world. It exists in our world. Our world is one of those possible worlds. And if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then the maximally great being exists. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. Does that make sense?
Well, am I like taking in the thing correctly? If what we're saying is if it's possible, that means that somebody had this thought in their head. If some human had a thought in their head that there is this maximally great being that exists. And in order for somebody to even think that,
Well,
there had to be a reason for that thought. Am I going way off the other?
no, I mean, like anybody can think of possible things that could possibly be, and we can think of things that are incoherent. So, you can think rationally of some possible thing. Now, like I said, this is purely philosophical, this argument. So yes, somebody themselves, I'm not saying by the thought of it, they are creating this being, but somebody can think in their mind of a maximally great being. They can give this being all the maximal attributes of the greatest possible being and give that to that being. That being must exist. That's what I'm saying. That's what the argument's saying. And somebody else could say, well, your being, somebody could increase your idea of a maximally great being by saying, well, it could be greater and improve upon a single person's idea. And then that would be the most maximally great being. Understand?
Yes and no. I'm not quite getting the leap.
The leap? Well,
That takes us to number 6, that leap.
No,
the concept of a maximally great being? Is that what we're...
so what, I guess maybe the first question is, what is a possible world? Some possible world.
Well,
What about God could not exist in any possible world? Maybe I need to turn that around and say, so I think God exists, but if this other person doesn't believe that, it doesn't fit into his possible world, and why is that, and how do we...
Because he's got a possible thought scared. There is no possible world.
so what your friend would have to say is that it's impossible. He would be disagreeing with the first premise. He would say that it's impossible for a maximally great being to exist. And that's basically where we'll be getting into as far as defending the argument.
And so if I were talking to somebody who's, didn't believe in God and this came up, I could say to them, you honestly believe it's impossible that this maximally great being exists?
Yeah.
And if so, tell me how that's not possible.
Right.
Okay.
All right. So, like the video said, premises 2 through 6 are largely incontroversial. They logically follow. So, logical argument. So number 1 is basically what we're going to deal with, whether it's possible. that even a maximally great being exists. So, initially, when this argument came forth with Anselm, the concept of, with this concept of the argument, he was critiqued because it said it could be applied to anything. You can say a maximally great island exists, or a maximally great pizza, like the video discussed, or a maximally great lion exists. Therefore, I mean, if you were to follow the same process, then they must exist, if that's the way you want to argue. Well, if you were to actually look at these ideas that people say, well, you could parody it to anything. The video critiques that there are no intrinsic values to a pizza. What do we mean by, what does the video mean by intrinsic values to that which we apply to something? An intrinsic value is a value that's essential to the nature of this described thing. Like the intrinsic quality of a dog is that they are loyal. All humans have intrinsic value, regardless of who they are or what they have to offer. Or as Christians, that's what we believe. As atheists, they say it would be good for you to all believe that, although there's no real basis for that belief. But at least as Christians, we view all humans as having an intrinsic value. So, getting back to the island and the pizza, what would be the intrinsic value of the pizza? Well, it would be delicious. But what would be the maximal intrinsic value of the pizza? The pizza would have to be maximally delicious. Well, what would that mean? Well, delicious would be a subjective concept, right? Somebody's opinion is going to be different than somebody else's. And one person's idea of a maximally delicious pizza is going to be different than another person's maximally delicious pizza. So that's what it means, is there's no maximal intrinsic values when it comes to a pizza. Or an island. You could give intrinsic values to an island, such as it could be relaxing, but when you add the thought of a maximally, the maximal island, or the maximally intrinsic values to an island, what would that mean? Well, one person's concept of being relaxing would be different than another person's concept of relaxing. So you're going to have different concepts of a maximally great island. So there are no maximally intrinsic values to an island. So that's what the video means when it talks about that. Now, when you get to something like a lion is a being, right? It's not just some thing, it's an actual being. So if we were to give a lion maximally intrinsic values, well, that lion would become all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect, necessarily existing lion. And with these attributes, you eventually would be describing God. The lion would no longer be a lion, the lion would be God. So, and that's Anselm's point. We all have the same concept of these maximal attributes. And if someone were able to describe a greater concept of God, then that would be God. God is the greatest being anyone can imagine or describe. Now, so that's That's initially what somebody may say whenever they view the argument. It's like you could parody this argument. One of the most popular objections that I've heard in regard to the concept of this argument is the attribute of necessarily existing. Necessarily existence is what makes this argument work, because a necessarily existing being would exist in all possible worlds, right? Not just one. But the objection would state that this argument presupposes that the quality of existence is greater than non-existence. All right? What if non-existence is greater than existence? Therefore, a maximally great being would necessarily not exist in any possible world. All right. So is existence actually better than non-existence?
Is your editorial comment?
Yep. Are we really arguing about this?
In other words, someone's arguing that could non-existence be better than or greater than, and it's automatically a moot point.
Right. Well, you could argue that a person, I could see how you could argue that a person who lives out there who is constantly in suffering, is constantly in pain, who's constantly being tortured or abused or whatever. Just think of the worst possible circumstance you can think of. I can see how you could argue that for that person, non-existence may be better. I could see that. I do not see how you could argue that non-existence would be better for a maximally great being. Right? I don't see how you could argue that for that being, for an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect, how for that kind of being, non-existence would be better. Right? So like I've said, this is the most popular objection that I've seen, and the objection is correct, all right? The argument does, in fact, presuppose that existence is greater than non-existence, all right? However, remember, you like I've said, you can't just object to something, right? You can't just say, well, what about this? Just saying it is possible that non-existence is a greater attribute than existence is not enough, right? Just making that claim is not enough. And all the times I've seen this objection, and I've seen it several times, I have not once seen anyone formulate an argument that concludes that non-existence is greater than existence in every possible circumstance, let alone for a maximally great being. Anytime I've seen this argument of whether existence is greater than non-existence, the answer is always it depends on the person's perspective, which means that there's no objective answer to the question or to the argument. And I believe that according to God, he who was, that is to say, that is good, what am I saying here? Right. So I believe, like, for God, for a maximally great being who is, all good, all powerful, that he would believe that it would be good for him to exist, right? Mm-hmm. So, and he would believe that it's always good for him to exist. And then it would be good for him that he must exist. So I've yet to see anybody come up with an argument saying that God, in God's perspective, it would be better for him to not exist. So like I said, you can't just bring up the objection. You gotta back it up with some sort of argument. So if someone were to bring up this objection, accept the criticism, you're right, but also challenge the critique by saying, feel free to convince me in a logical argument which concludes that from God's perspective, non-existence is a greater attribute than existence. Like I said, I've yet to see anybody even try. As the video describes, for something not to be possible, there has to become some sort of logical contradiction with the concept of a maximally great being. Some examples given were like a married bachelor, square circle, or the smell of blue. Would the attributes of a maximally great being have logical contradictions? At first glance, intuitively, the response would be, it seems like the idea of a maximally great being is perfectly coherent. However, some would say, no, that's not the case. So let's take a look at a few of the examples of God's attributes and how it's said that they conflict. So let's take a first look at some of common paradoxes. Can God create a rock too heavy for him to lift? Right? It doesn't matter how you answer this question, it will lead you to the conclusion that God is therefore not omnipotent. So how would you answer this if someone to bring up this paradoxical contradiction? Anybody have any ideas?
I've noticed that in a fair few times in my life, somebody's thrown at it is that if God is all-knowing, then he would know not to let something be heavy. That's probably pretty simplistic.
I think just the fact that God can create mountains that I cannot lift is omnipotent enough for me.
Right.
You know?
All right. So
But if he was all-powerful, then you couldn't out-create himself to create one that he could.
well, okay. All right. The simple way to answer this is to define what we mean by omnipotent and all-powerful. All right. When we describe God as all-powerful, we're not saying God can do. We're saying God can do all things that's logically possible for him to do. Okay? So, no, it is not possible for God to create a rock too heavy for him to lift, because that would be logically impossible for him to do that. It's logically incoherent for him to do something like that.
It's not a lack in his ability to create, it's a lack of his failure to be able to lift anything.
Exactly. It would go against who God is for him to have something that he can't move, right? It's logically incoherent against the concept of God. So God can do all things that are logically possible for him to do. Okay? So another statement is, nobody knows that this sentence is true. If God knows this sentence to be true, then he does not know the sentence to be true. And if God does not know the sentence to be true, then the sentence is true. And therefore God does not know the truth of the statement. So it's another paradox. So no matter how you answer the question, the conclusion is always going to be, therefore God is not omniscient. God is not all-knowing. Once again, How would you answer this? Right?
Well, we're saying that have we created the sentence, or has God created the sentence?
If someone were to present this sentence and say, does God know this sentence to be true? What would you say?
I would say a human being created the sentence, nobody knows if the sentence is true.
Right.
And we are fools to say because God knows whether or not anything is true. A human can't dictate to God what he can and can't do.
Right. But you understand the paradox of the sentence? They're trying to put God in an inescapable box, right? Once again, we have to describe what we mean when we say God is omniscient, all right? God does not enter into logical contradictions, all right? It goes against the logical concept of God. It's logically incoherent to believe that God does not know something, right? It goes against the very concept of God. So, no, God does not know something that's actually true. God does not enter into logical contradictions. Does that make sense? So now we know what we mean. Now we know that we must define the terms of God's attributes and not let other people define them for us, right? We know that God does not enter logical contradictions. Now there's further objections to the attributes given to a maximum great being. It is said that if these attributes were taken to their maximal value, they would contradict each other. All right? So,
Would, in a sense, outweigh each other?
all right. So here's an example. One example would be omnipotence, meaning all-powerful, and moral perfection. All right? It is said that God is not capable of the action of sin. So God is incapable of lying, for example. Or God is incapable of doing any kind of action of sin. Well, if God does not have the freedom or the capability to do certain actions, therefore he's not all-powerful. All right? Here's another example. Justice and mercy. How can God have the maximal value of mercy and the maximal value of justice at the same time? These would contradict themselves.
But again, that's in the human mind.
I'm bringing this up.
Yeah.
These are it. So, how would you address these objections?
I think the cross explains it all.
Well, how would you address these objections to a non-believer?
I would still explain it to them now. God is a very just God. Every sin that ever was committed had to be paid for in his just mind. And because of his perfect mercy, he paid for all of it. Both were accomplished on the cross. Perfect justice and perfect mercy.
No, yeah. But all right, so let's say, somebody who didn't accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, okay? And they're brought before judgment before God, all right? But God is has mercy to the highest value. If God were not to give that person mercy,
So if God is all merciful with this person who rejected him, then how could he be
how could he be all merciful?
and all just?
Yep. That's the objection. How can God be all merciful and yet be a just God at the same time?
But allowing every person to deny him.
Himself.
I'm sorry, what?
I being logical to himself. Aren't they assuming that justice and mercy are opposites?
Yep.
And
You're getting there. You're getting there. All right. So, where am I at? All right. In regard to the first one, Anselm, the way Anselm answered this objection is by stating that the action of sin does not give you more power. Right? The action of sin is a weakness. Therefore, to be able to sin is to be weak. Another way to look at this objection is to continue to state once again that God cannot enter into logical contradictions. For God to commit sin would to go against his very nature. It would go against who God is. To act in a complete moral way is to act in the very way that God would act. To act in the way that God would act. To act in a way that God would not act is the very definition of sin. Therefore, it doesn't make logical sense that God would be capable of sinning. Right? And as for the second one, we must realize that God is also omniscient. Right? You can't just isolate these things out. God is also omniscient and morally perfect, which would bring mercy and justice into perfect balance. Where mercy should be shown, mercy will be given. When mercy is given when it shouldn't be, that becomes injustice. When justice is required, there will be justice. When justice is given where mercy should be shown, that's unmerciful. It would be the perfect amount of mercy and the perfect amount of justice. And only God would be able to tell the difference. Furthermore, the idea that there might be no possible world in which all the traditional divine attributes are co-exemplified. There is a model of the maximally great being presented by philosophers Mike Almeida, and I am not even going to try that one. They state that the consistence problems for the maximal properties are a result of the degree of these properties and not the kind of these properties. So, for example, if you would take the maximum value of the properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, you could put them in a set. All right? So you can put them in a set that's something like this. So, like set 1, you got omnipotence, and you got a little m. So that's the maximum value. And you got omniscience, and you got a little m. And that's the maximum value of omniscience. And you got omnibenevolence, and you got a little m for the maximum. Right? So in that set, all the attributes are set to the highest maximal value. If the consistency of the divine attributes are unable to be co-exemplified in any possible world, with this set, then you can proceed to the next set. So that would be omnipotence m minus 1, so on and so forth. So you can set the different attributes to different degrees until it reaches the highest consistent set, and that becomes uniquely exemplified. No two beings could exemplify that set. So only one maximally great being could represent that set. So this model does not assume that the first set does have any inconsistencies. Personally, myself, I do not believe that there are any inconsistencies, but it's stating that just in case there are any inconsistencies, one can imagine another set where there are no inconsistencies. So the maximal being would still have these divine properties set to a different degree. But the properties would be set to the highest possible degree without any inconsistencies. Does that make sense? So I've yet to see anyone object to this model of the maximally great being, but the work's relatively new. It only came out maybe earlier this year. But it's just to show that you can present the idea of this maximally great being without any actual logical inconsistencies. And if there are no logical inconsistencies with the idea of a maximally great being, therefore, it's at least possible for a maximally great being to exist, right? For you to get to the realm of being impossible, for it not to be possible, you have to come up with a logical contradiction. There's one more objection that I want to address, and that is the argument, is this argument begging the question, right? Is this argument creating the begging the question fallacy, meaning that the argument presupposes the existence of God to prove the existence of God? Which, if it does, it indeed would commit that fallacy. However, the idea of presupposing the possible existence of God only comes from looking at this argument by itself. Think of the other arguments that we've discussed. Leibniz's contingency argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the moral argument. It seems we have a reasonable case for our first premise to be that it's at least possible that a maximally great being exists. So, in conclusion, I think we have been able to successfully defend premise 1, meaning that it is indeed at least possible that a maximally great being exists. And if premise 1 is correct, then the rest of the argument becomes sound. Thus, a maximally great being exists. So, here's the argument again, if you want to look at it. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. And if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world, in our world. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Therefore, a maximally great being exists.
And has anyone ever been able to successfully